cycle organized by the RET in Buenos Aires, the Facoltà Valdese in Rome, and the Stellenbosch University in South Africa. If you want the Spanish translation, you can, just a second. There is a message that came here. Okay, if you want to translate the translation, you can choose in the lower part of the screen, there is a small word or something with the interpretation of something written on it, and then you can choose the language, either English or Spanish, and then you have to mute the original audio in the last part of the window that opens when you click on the word. Okay, I hope this is clear. And so again, welcome. The title of this third cycle is Narratives in Dispute, Theological Discernment and Dialogue in and Between Different Contexts. So freedom is the topic of the next three meetings. Now, just a few words to start with. How do we tell freedom today? How do we want others to understand our comprehension of freedom? In their struggle for freedom, many people in today's world develop their own idea of freedom, often inspired by what other people in time and space said about it. But so often, in fighting for their own freedom, people oppress other people, delegitimizing, denying other understanding of freedom. So there is a conflict coming up. One of our tasks as theologians is to help people around the world to think about freedom in connection with the Bible and in connection with the theology of these 2,000 years of Christian history, with the help, of course, of other human sciences. In this way, maybe we will be able to help humankind to overcome conflicts and fears that lead to oppression of other peoples, perceived as dangerous and hostile. This raises, of course, many questions, and we will go through some of these questions in this meeting and in the next two meetings. So I was saying this raises many questions. For instance, what are the political and social effects of God delivering us from the power of evil? We talk so much about being delivered by the power of evil. Well, what does it mean in real life when you think politically and socially? For example, Martin Luther stated that a Christian is a free person, but at the same time, servant of everybody else. So how do we decline? How do we talk about these things? How do we translate this idea in today's world? These are just a few examples of what we are going to talk about in this meeting and in the next meeting. Today, we have a main speaker who is Professor Daniele Garrone from the Facoltà Valdese di Teologia, Valdensian Faculty of Theology. He is professor of Old Testament. He is also president of the Federation of the Protestant Churches in Italy. He's been president of the Bible Society in Italy, and so on. I could continue a lot. He's done a lot of job in translating and working on connections on different levels between our faculty and lots of other also institutions and realities. So he has a long career as a professor of Old Testament in our theological seminary. The title of his lecture is il paradigma dell'esodo e le nostre libertà, so in Italian, the paradigm of the Exodus and our freedoms. So we go back to the first, or one of the first ways to tell freedom to others. His lecture will be followed by two respondents. The first one will be Carolina Rosa Altana, who's graduated in theology, and in her self-presentation says wife, mother, grandmother, and feminist. So this is very nice way to introduce you. She was born in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and she has courses on the Bible, New Testament, for women's group and ecumenical groups. She's also teaching the Koine, the Greek of the New Testament. She wrote a book whose title is The Grandmothers of Jesus, which is quite interesting. She's specialized in this kind of comments in the perspective of reading the Bible from a gender perspective, in order to create, as I read from her self-presentation, in order to create spaces of freedom for women in their own context. So this is her perspective, her reading, point of reading the Bible. And she will follow Daniele Garrone's lecture. And the other respondent is Simon Sesula from Stellenbosch, from the University of Stellenbosch. As I can see from his curriculum, he did all his studies in Stellenbosch, and he is an Old Testament professor, and since 2022, the head of the department, and from June 23, the chair of the Transformation Committee, and also chair of the Winter School of the Faculty of Stellenbosch. If you look at the website of the University of Stellenbosch, you see a long series of publications, so I will not go through all of them. And so you see two different points of view, Old Testament and New Testament, answering the lecture of Professor Daniele Garrone on the Exodus story. I don't think I have other things to say as introductory issues, so I'm glad to give the word to Professor Daniele Garrone. I remember you have 20 minutes for your lecture, and then we can go on with the respondents, and at the end of the meeting, we will have time for questions and, if possible, answers. Please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I apologize from the very, very beginning for the bad quality of my pronunciation, but I am too old to change it, so I hope you can understand me nevertheless. In the short time we have, I want to propose that we relate our current discussions on freedom, law, and democracy to the book of Exodus and to the paradigm that can be deduced from it, and the role that the category of covenant plays in it. Reading, because I already read the contribution of the two discussants, I am very aware that when I say our current discussion on freedom, I refer to the European situation, and if you want, particularly I have two countries in mind, Italy and Germany, because, as you know, fascism was a creation, a made in Italy product that was implemented in Germany. But we have been liberated from our dictatorships, dictatorship that had also a great support among the population, and we became parliamentary constitutional democracies. And now, 80 years later, many people are not at ease with parliaments. We have right-wing movements in Germany and in Italy. And that's the reason why, even in our public contribution as a Federation of Protestant Churches, we are trying to defend these categories: parliament, constitution, democracy, and so on. Okay. Certainly, the Exodus narrative is not intended to found a democratic vision, and to think of it, it would be an anachronism. Rather, the perspective of the book of Exodus is a theocentric perspective. God is a sovereign to whom all the earth belongs, and he wants to govern the earth. But even in this context, Exodus expresses a dialectic that by no chance has been taken up in modern political thought. This is not my field of study, but if you think of the idea, the covenantal idea in the modern political reflection, we could quote Althusius and others. Okay. This I beg your pardon, dove sei? The Sinai Covenant, the chapters 19 to 40 to 24 of the book of Exodus open with a declaration made by God, recalling deliverance. In the book of Exodus, the account of liberation, of the liberation from slavery in Egypt, the chapters from chapter 3 to 15, leads to indeed culminate in the stipulation of the covenant, Exodus 19 to 24. I refer to the text in the form which we read it. I am aware of the history of tradition, redaction, criticism, and so on. But I think it's also useful to read the text as they are, and this the way they have been read in the history of transmission and interpretation. The result is a paradigm. Freedom is liberation. The Jewish people, they were slaves, and now they are free on the other side of the Red Sea. And now life in freedom is shaped by a covenant that binds all those who have been liberated to the God of liberation and to each other, and they freely agree to this covenant. The opening discourse of God in Exodus 19:33 and following is parallel to another similar one, who was already located at the mountain of God, and always with the request that Moses should report everything to the people, his famous speech of Exodus 3. And it's not a coincidence that deliverance and covenant are both introduced by a programmatic discourse of God. And another important feature is that the opening speech of God in Exodus 19 is built like a frame around the two collections of laws, the Decalogue and the so-called Book of the Covenant. And the other part of this frame is the stipulation of the covenant and the following Visio Dei. You remember the people, 70 elders, and Aaron and 2 of his sons, so the representative of laity and clergy of the entire people of God are admitted to see God. The liberation is the first issue, and then the law comes next. And this law, my covenant, is proposed to the people of former slaves who are now become free. So it's a kind of pactual, contractual dynamic. And important is to note, it's not a covenant in the sense that all elements are negotiated. If you agree to be my people and to follow my law, I will liberate you. Liberation is the foundation, is a decision of God. Liberation, deliverance has already taken place, and it's not made in exchange for submission to the law. The covenant bond is proposed, not imposed, on free subjects. And I think it's very important. I want to shorten a little here to save some minutes, but it's important that, that the people says 3 times he agrees with the proposal of God. This threefold reiteration is intentional and certainly pregnant. And from the first to the last, the level of awareness and therefore responsibility increases. The first time, the people accept the divine proposal so to say, on trust. Okay, God has spoken, we will do his will. But then follows the communication of the divine will, first the Decalogue, and then the so-called Book of the Covenant. You remember that the Decalogue was heard by all the people, but then the people was fearing that God was too far, too close to them, and so there is the mediation of Moses. At this point, after the Book of the Covenant, we have the second ascent, this time with more knowledge, because the commandments has been heard, the Decalogue from all the people, from the entire people. However, this is not the end of the negotiations, because Moses writes down the law out. It's, if I can say so, it's when we buy an apartment, for instance, we first have a gentleman agreement, then a third kind of stipulation, and only at the end, everything is read and you have to sign. I think the text want to give us this kind of impression. Only at the end, only after the third ascent, the covenant is stipulated. Now, what is the meaning, the significance of the law of the covenant? I am aware that the discussion should also include the Book of the Covenant, and one of the discussants will make this observation, and I agree with him. But I limit myself to the Decalogue, following a wonderful reading made by Frank Huseman, who has tried to read the 10 Commandments in a socio-historical perspective. It's not, the 10 Commandments are not a compendium of moral principles. And you know, this was the role the Decalogue played in Christian catechesis, a summary of all ethical concerns. And it is not a synthesis, a summary of the entire Torah. If you think of the fact that many chapters of the Torah are devoted to worship, sacrifices, rituals, and so on. nothing is prescribed in the Ten Commandments regarding worship or the ritual or sacral sphere. There is at the beginning the prohibition to worship other gods. This is the only concern. According to Kuseman, the addressee of the Decalogue has its own sociological concreteness, and we should underline that if you want to understand the intention of the text. The addressee, it is a free male adult smallholder. Each of these qualification is pregnant with meaning. The Ten Commandments are speaking of the freedom of a free male adult Israelite smallholder. I underline that not because I agree and want freedom only for males. I am describing what we read. The freedom that one of these free male adult Israelite smallholder received is the same as his fellow, equally liberated as the former. It's so the freedom of the equal freedom of my fellow is not only a limit to my freedom, is the same foundation of my freedom. It is not only a question of freedom, but I would say, while being aware of anachronism, of inviolable rights. Only some examples. For an adult Israelite male, free little owner, there is no longer freedom if the following rights are threatened. Life, if you are killed, you are no longer free. Property, and not in the modern sense of an ideology of property, but you have a field, sheep, some tools, and without them, you are no longer free. And even the prohibition of adultery is not a compendium of sexual ethics, since one of the goods of a free male at that time was the integrity of his family. And perhaps above all, he wanted to be sure that his children are his own children and not some of them child of the Uncle Tom passing by. And even the invitation to honor father and mother has a sociological background. You have to take care of the dignity of your parents, even in the time they are losing their power. You spend most of your life under your father, and now he's sick, and you cannot put him in a corner. And we know from ancient Near Eastern sources that a proper burial and even taking care of your father when he's drunk belong to this kind of respect of his dignity and freedom. This said, the Sinaitic covenant has its own universalism. The idea is that all the members of his people, since they were slaves and now they are free, all of them have equal rights and equal duties. I am still describing, and one possible objection is, okay, this was good for Israel, but the other people and the foreigners. But don't forget that we are in the, let's say, 500 before Jesus Christ. And if you think of the road we have had to go before discovering in Europe, in the world, another kind of universalism, okay. So what I propose for our discussion is the following question. Could this paradigm consisting of liberation and covenant, I ask myself if this is not very useful for our discussion in the current situation. As I said at the beginning, at least in Europe, constitutional parliamentary democracies born out of experiences of liberation, for instance, from dictatorship, are now challenging by populism, by the emphasis on the will of the people, and not only by neo-Nazis or extra right wing. Even in the center, many people are saying what makes democracy is the will of the people. We, the Italian and the German, when we listen to these words, the will of the people, without constitution, without a covenant with other citizens, without citizenship, the people, as the people would be something organic, expressing physiologically an identity. Only the majority without the balance of powers. I think we should be worrying about our future, and perhaps this is my suggestion, these all categories of liberation and free bond to a common law and to the other fellows and citizens could help us to avoid some kind of disaster. So I do not believe that the Exodus account founds modern democracy and constitutionalism, but what it affirmed in its context and distance from current issues is nevertheless relevant and indicative for our theological evaluation of democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. Thank you very much. Okay, I was looking for the clapping hands, but I couldn't find it. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I think that we can go now to the first respondent. So, Carolina, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, es muy lindo estar aquí y qué bueno es que tres importantes casas de estudio y formación, disculpen, sí, sigo escuchando tu voz, Silvia.
En la interpretación, pasate al audio original, si no, Carolina, ahí en los botoncitos, escuchar en audio
¿Cómo?
original.
No te escucho. Ahora sí. ¿Ahora sí? ¿Ahora no te escucho yo? ¿Ahora estoy bien? Buenísimo. Bueno, disculpen. Bueno, decía que para mí es muy lindo estar aquí y que tres importantes casas de estudio y formación puedan reunirse para reflexionar sobre la libertad y sus diferentes narrativas. Qué bueno que Daniele Garrone nos plantee revisar el paradigma del éxodo en relación con nuestras libertades, con nuestras organizaciones sociales y políticas y con nuestra vida democrática. Y que, bueno, también es poder actualizar, contextualizar y traer a nuestra cotidianeidad la palabra. En el marco de este tercer ciclo de encuentros sobre libertad, narrativas en disputa, Daniele Garrone nos propone releer desde el Éxodo la actualidad de nuestras democracias en clave de libertad y alianza. Una libertad en la que los sujetos del pacto, varones, asumen y adhieren a él sobre la base de su propia libertad y la igual libertad del otro. La libertad como vínculo a una ley superior libremente asumida, con un alto nivel de conciencia y de compromiso que literariamente se plasman en la triple aceptación de Éxodo 19, 8, 24, 3 y 24, 7. Sin dudas, el Éxodo es un muy buen lugar desde donde comenzar, aunque deberíamos especificar que el foco del paradigma está puesto en el pacto del Sinaí, en la liberación como presupuesto y en el pacto. Una liberación por parte de Dios hacia su pueblo que ya ha tenido lugar como acto incondicional suyo, que no es parte de una negociación, que la precede. Esto es hermoso. Sin embargo, siento que nos estamos quedando a mitad de camino. ¿Alcanza solamente con repensar la liberación que Dios realiza a favor de un pueblo oprimido, el pueblo de su propiedad personal entre todos los pueblos? El pueblo de Israel necesitaba configurar a un Dios personal y que los hiciera sentir únicos. Pero esta alianza ¿es suficiente hoy? Garrone profundiza en el siguiente paradigma. La libertad es liberación. La vida es en libertad está configurada por un pacto que vincula a todos los que han sido liberados con el Dios de la liberación y entre sí. Luego, siguiendo a Kruzman, se detiene en los destinatarios, varones, israelitas, libres e iguales. Como espejitos de colores nos deslumbran las palabras libertad e igualdad. Ciertamente, estos valores han sido muy importantes en cantidad de luchas revolucionarias, emancipatorias y hasta para la teología. Nos han llevado por relaciones sociales de mayor equidad, dignidad e identidad. Pero volvamos a las y los destinatarios. Como dice Garrone, la tríada libertad, ley, igualdad se aplica en una esfera circunscripta. Ese exclusivismo de pueblo elegido entre otros, ¿a cuántos deja afuera? ¿A quiénes deja afuera? El mercado lo ha visto rápidamente. Hay unos pocos varones, blancos, libres, para quienes la tríada es valiosa. El otro, el igualmente libre, ese es mi límite. Hoy vemos con profundo dolor que ese pacto no libera, deshumaniza, aturde, se cierra, excluye y hasta esclaviza. El mismo sistema, para evitar que lo rechacemos, se viste de libertad. Y ahí caemos en la trampa nuevamente, la trampa de creer que no hay personas pobres, excluidas, excluidos, mujeres, diversidades, niñas, niños, ancianas, ancianos, pueblos originarios, personas víctimas de trata, personas víctimas de abuso, violaciones y guerras. La libertad es para unos pocos y pocas. Permítanme por un momento llevarlos a mi campo de especialidad. el Nuevo Testamento. Jesús de Nazaret nos dice que Él no ha venido a abolir las leyes, sino a darles cumplimiento. Esto lo vemos en Mateo 5, 17. Hizo en su tiempo lo que creo intentamos hacer hoy en este ciclo de encuentros. Jesús llama a Abba, a ese Dios liberador, que ama incondicionalmente, y no se queda en el acto liberador, sino que acompaña el caminar en forma de alianza. Jesús es quien nos saca de ese exclusivismo de las y los destinatarios del pacto. Y eso se ve en su praxis. Cuidó con delicadeza, curó cuerpo y alma, enseñó a pensar, repensar y repensarnos, incluyó sin distinciones, se jugó por el reino enfrentando poderes. El avance de las derechas que generan muerte, pobreza, guerras, violencias, desinterés, injusticias, exclusión, destrato, ignorancia, desempleo y despreocupación podrían ser el resultado de que como cristianas y cristianos hemos dejado de mirar como miraba Jesús. Podemos repensar el paradigma para nuestras democracias, para nuestras organizaciones e instituciones como cristianas y cristianos de este siglo. Pero si vamos a encarar esta tarea, antes debemos tener la certeza de que todas y todos participen de la mesa comunitaria. La ética del cuidado, de la solidaridad, de la inclusión y del amor, tal como la vivió nuestro maestro, no pueden esperar. Para seguir reflexionando, nos unimos a la propuesta de Daniele de repensar el paradigma de liberación y pacto como clave para nuestras circunstancias actuales en democracia. Podemos pensar en acciones liberadoras concretas sin perder de vista a los y las destinatarios. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for responding to the Okay, now the floor is yours, Simon, please.
Okay. The idea of equality for all in a democracy is captivating. For this reason, my colleague Daniel Garon's assertion that the law guarantees safeguarding of freedom for all in the twofold sense that the freedom of one is limited by the safeguarding of the same freedom for the other, and that all are called upon not to lose the foundation of freedom, namely the liberating God, is refreshing. Considering this view, his proposal that this paradigm, consisting of liberation and covenant, enlighten us in the current situation in which our constitutional parliamentary democracies born out of experiences of liberation are challenged by populisms, by the emphasis on the will of the people without the constraint of a superordinate and freely assumed law as the basis of citizenship, is attractive. Since this conceptualization of freedom is based on the Sinai Covenant, I prefer to call it a Sinai covenantal justice. This Sinai covenantal justice becomes even more appealing if one considers the exercise of human rights in South Africa. For example, if one has money, he or she can violate the human rights of the less fortunate and employ the services of the most powerful lawyers to get away with it. Nevertheless, two things deserve serious special attention. The first one is that the triad freedom, law, equality applies in a circumscribed sphere, the people of Israel. The second one is the covenant itself. The rest of the discussion revolves around these two issues, starting with the triad of freedom, law, equality that applies in Israel. My colleague asserts, I quote, the triad freedom, law, equality applies in a circumscribed sphere. Certainly, it is the people of Israel, unquote. My understanding of this assertion is that the application of these principles is limited to the people of Israel. The Sinaitic covenant was made specifically with the Israelites, setting them apart as God's chosen people. These principles of freedom, law, and equality were meant to govern their society and their relationship with God. While these principles of freedom, law, and equality are universal values, their specific application within the Sinaitic covenant was tailored to Israel's historical and cultural context. In other words, the Sinaitic covenantal justice guaranteed the equation freedom plus law equals equality within Israel. Within the Sinaitic covenantal justice, with the Sinaitic covenantal justice viewed from this perspective, what are the implications for ethical principles within the Sinaitic covenant concerning non-Israelite communities? The attention here is not to the Gerim, that is the sojourners, but the Amnokrim, meaning foreign people. There's a footnote here. An enlightening differentiation between the two concepts is by Kathleen Farmer. Unlike the sojourner or resident alien who was subject to and protected by the Israelite laws, the foreigner was not allowed to participate in Passover celebrations. The foreigner could be charged interest on loans, and debts owed by foreigners did not have to be forgiven in the seventh year. So that's the difference between the Gerim and the Nokrim. Now, to respond to this question, it might be enlightening to move beyond the 10 Commandments and look at the covenant code broadly. Now, looking at beyond the 10 Commandments, Exodus 23, verse 20 to 33 refers to the Israelites and the Canaanite nations. Verse 23 says, I quote, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, I will destroy them completely, unquote. Despite all the exegetical gymnastics to project the Sinaitic covenantal justice as universalistic, the reception of Exodus 23, verse 20 to 33 has been disastrous for nations occupying land desired by the Israelites. This law is renewed in Deuteronomy 7, 1 to 3. I quote, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Attack them. You must utterly annihilate them. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. You must not intermarry with them, unquote. Interestingly, the interpretation of Exodus 34, verse 11 to 16, which Michael Fishbein strongly recounts, arises from Exodus 23, verse 20 to 33, and Deuteronomy 7, 1 to 6, which is the renewal of Exodus 23, verse 20 to 33. The interpretation of these passages implements Ezra and his partisans' campaign to dissolve the so-called foreign marriages, with its inevitably disruptive and even tragic consequences. Furthermore, During the 20th century in South Africa, Michael Pryor reports, I quote, "The Bible served as the source of Boer identity, and that as they trekked, the Boers considered themselves to be chosen people rescued from Egypt, which was British oppression, on their way to the promised land. The indigenous black people were the Canaanites who served foreign gods whom Israel should not marry." This is a historical process in South Africa where the Afrikaners saw themselves as the Israelites. This is the phenomenon that culminated in the political crisis of apartheid. Presenting the Palestinian and North American natives' view on the Exodus, Eliezer Fernandez says, I quote, "Palestinians, as pointed out by Naim Atik and Mitri Raheb, find the Exodus narrative extremely disturbing. For the Palestinians, Exodus signifies conquest, not liberation. As such, the Exodus narrative becomes a narrative of terror. In resonance with the Palestinians, Robert Allen Warrior argues that, like the biblical Canaanites, American Indians have also suffered conquest and genocide at the hands of those who escaped from the Old World and laid claim to the promised land of the New World. For American Indians, therefore, the Exodus narrative proves a narrative of terror as well, an Exodus conquest narrative," unquote. Satyanathan Clark and Peniel Rajkumar, representing a section of the Dalit people in India, also decry the Exodus as a paradigm for their liberation. Without doubt, there are sections of the world population who view the Exodus as part of the problem for their liberation. In such a situation, is an exploration of an alternative tradition other than the Exodus tradition not worth a try? The Book of Chronicles, for example, from the look of things, deliberately avoided the Exodus as its introduction to its narrative of the monarchy. It opted for the universalistic genealogies in Genesis, starting from Adam. Its conclusion introduces a foreigner being the savior of the Israelites with the mandate from God. Commenting on this chronicler's approach, Louis Jonker says, I quote, "The inclusion of the figure of Cyrus at the conclusion of Chronicles not only served a literary function, but also concluded the whole history of Israel from a universalistic perspective. The book starts with Adam and ends with Cyrus. With those figures bracketing his historiography, the chronicler put the history of Israel within the context of wider humanity and the nations," unquote. Remarking on the exclusion of the Exodus by the chronicler, Sarah Jaffet says, I quote, "Not only has the historical event been omitted from the chronistic narrative, references to it have been deleted in parallel text," unquote. Michael Pryor's sentiment is this, I quote, "The Bible itself is not value-free, and in the Exodus narrative is disdainful of the rights of the indigenous people," unquote. Thank you. I leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, the text of the Exodus can be explosive in two different ways, as we can see, if we can say that. Thank you very much. We have questions to Professor Garrone so that we can finally answer to the respondents and to the questions, if you have. So please raise your hand so that I can give you the word.
Who's speaking?
So maybe we can start with you, Daniele. You can answer to your respondents, and then maybe if there is one more question from the other participants, we can give them the word. Please, Daniele.
Don't you mean it's better to have other reaction before or not?
Well, so far nobody raised his hand or her hand.
I agree with most of the comments. Perhaps that's true. It's true that in the Hebrew Bible there are different perspectives. And for instance, Exodus 23, Deuteronomy 7 are part of a revision of the text made in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. You can read many works of Thomas Römer stressing this point. There is a new interpretation of Israel's identity against other identities and other people. It's true that the book of Chronicles let out not only the Exodus story, but also the conquest, the occupation. That's true. I try to defend my position saying that it is not that the ideas of democracy, equality were at disposal, and the Sinai covenant limits all this to Israel. It's the contrary. Even this very limited interpretation for one people before is God became later a paradigm used and useful to say what we are saying today, that all men are created equals, that the liberty is the same. And so what was stated for the free male, smallholder, and so on, is what we want for all humankind. This was my idea. And in fact, I am rereading, because I already the book of Jan Hassmann in German, but now we have a good Italian translation, so I read the book again. I think this was his idea, without denying the antiquity of the Exodus story, its connection in the ancient world, but nevertheless they invented something was new, and I think still valid as a paradigm, not as a. And only one other sentence: the only exclusivity in the Sinai covenant, when the text says that Israel is the treasury, the particularly own treasury of God, but this has implication only for the obligation of Israel. Since it is the particular property of God, only Israel has to be subdued to that law. And you know that in the even in the rabbinic tradition, the day of the judgment, there will be two different paradigms. We, the heathen, will not be excluded because we didn't observe the 613 mitzvot. We will be judged according to another universal law. So I want to say that even in the tradition, there are attempts to join the particular calling for Israel and universalism. The destruction of the former inhabitants of Canaan, on the one hand, no people, no genocide did happen. We should also read the Bible as we read fairy tales. But I think that the people who were responsible of taking Joshua, the book of Joshua, for instance, as a actual political program were Protestants, not the Jews. Even in the 2nd century before Christ, what they could make is to let some Edomites to be circumcised. But the people who took this text as a program are the Puritans and other Protestants in the United States of America, saying we are fleeing from Europe, we are refugees, and now God opens in front of us a promised land, and we have to be grateful and to occupy everything. And since the inhabitants are Canaanites, they are not believers, we can deal very hard with them. And we found a lot of township with nice biblical names. And I think the same idea was in the history of South Africa, people leaving Europe and discovering, thanks to God, a wonderful promised land. And among them, there was also Waldensian, developing an ideology called Malang, as a present right-wing deputy in Italy. I don't know if he belonged to the same family, if he was a descendant. I will ask him. Okay.
Thank you. And I think this is quite interesting, because in the New Testament, you have, when you talk about the promised land, the promises of God, and all these things, they prefer to talk about Abraham than to talk about Moses taking the people out of Egypt. So it's really, we should really be careful in referring too easily to these biblical stories without considering very well the connections, the readings that were done through the centuries. Okay, somebody else has a question or wants to raise an issue. Otherwise, we will be perfectly on time in closing this meeting. As an Italian, I have problems with that, but okay, if there are
May I translate
Yes.
into Italian your two contributions, Simon and Carolina, and give them to my students? Not publishing, only giving to the, or not?
Yes, please, you can, because this is an idea that we need to look at and explore. So the more we talk about it, the better. You can give them.
Carolina, do you agree or not?
Sí, por supuesto. Para mí es un gusto y un honor, como mujer latinoamericana, argentina, que podamos entrar en este diálogo, ¿no? Y que pueda resultar enriquecedor para muchos y muchas más. Así que muchísimas gracias.
Okay, very good. So we can close. First of all, remembering all of you, the next meeting that will be next week on the 21st of October, same time. It depends on where you are in the world, but let's say 11 o'clock in Buenos Aires. Well, to those in Buenos Aires, I also wish you a good buon appetito. Enjoy your meal. And I want to say thank you again to Professor Daniele Garrone, to Professor Simon Sesula, and to Professor Carolina Altana for your interventions, for your ideas. I think it was a good time to develop a topic, to start developing a topic that is really wide and quite important for biblical studies and Christian theology in general. Okay, thank you very much. I wish you a pleasant day, evening, or whatever, and see you next week on this channel at this time. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye bye.